Here we are again, and I am going to invite my two panelists to come out here. It's a product conversation. I'm always a little reluctant to do the show of hands thing, but how many product people out there? We got a few, all right. So this one's for you and for everybody else. So what I'm going to do, the title is Pivoting with Agility. We were playing with pivoting with clumsiness, but we decided that wasn't going to work, so we went with agility, thought it was more apropos to what's been going on over the last couple of years with the need to, everyone's had to pivot, one way or another on the product side, sales, whatever it is. So we're going to talk about pivoting from a product perspective. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to ask my two panelists to introduce themselves and their companies. Obviously, they're both in a product role, but they can tell you exactly what their role is. Kim, why don't you start?
Great, nice to see everyone today, and thanks for joining us. I look forward to the conversation around product. So really quickly, I work for Newfold Digital, which is the combination of Web.com and Endurance that recently happened at the beginning of the year, which was really exciting for us. Specifically, I am over our website, e-commerce, and professional service lines, and I've been with the company for over 11 years, so a lot of fun times to see over the last year.
Several companies over the course of 11 years.
Many companies over. Okay. Yes, absolutely.
All right, John?
Hi, I'm John Foreman, and I am Chief Product Officer for Podium.com. Podium is a local business marketing and communication and payments platform. Prior to doing product at Podium, I was Chief Product Officer for a company called MailChimp, which actually was just acquired by Intuit recently. So I've been doing product for a number of years.
I'd say you missed out, but no one had equity, right?
Yeah.
So, no biggie, right?
Yeah, that's a conversation for another time, but
okay.
True.
All right, so moving on. Let's start with, so even though it's teed up as a sort of a COVID product conversation, and I'd like to start with that, but we're going to kind of get into a broader conversation about the product process. But let's start with kind of the pivot theme. I'd like each of you to kind of talk about a pivot you had to do, like in response to the COVID, eruption, black swan, whatever you want to call it. John, why don't you start?
Yeah, COVID was an interesting time for Podium. We support a bunch of local business communication products, right? So that's reviews, that's web chat, that's an inbox, et cetera. And when COVID struck, it basically redefined how a customer journey operates with a local business. At its most crude, it's, I want to interact with this local business, but I can't see y'all or talk to y'all in person, right? And one of the most critical parts of the customer journey that then got sort of messed up or disrupted was collecting payment. And so a lot of our customers came to us and said, hey, we're using y'all to text people, we're using you for other things like collecting reviews, surveys, et cetera. Can you help us with payment? And so we introduced a card not present payments product, just sort of shifted real quick over to, all right, what can we do? What can we get out there? So let's do card not present payment. So that's, hey, let me just text you, hit this link, pay us for whatever that service is, whether you're a dentist or a lawyer or an electrician. And then they could collect payment really quickly. And that ended up snowballing into, we now have a run rate of about $3 billion a year in payments that we are processing for local businesses. They realized once this happened that, like, wait a second, even if people can come in, boy, is it nice to just text them and say, pay me, especially if it's past due. So they've started uploading lists of just like, you didn't pay me. And they text people and lo and behold, they pay. So that pivot ended up being kind of nice.
So are you seeing any data that shows like, past due, reduction in past due rate? Have you ever
Yeah, especially in something like healthcare, right? Mm-hmm. So healthcare providers often have a lot of past due payments, or they've got folks out and about somewhere. Maybe they couldn't process that payment right at the beginning because of insurance stuff. So you got to wait and figure out how much they really owe. So being able to text someone later and be like, hey, that thing you did 60 days ago, here's how much you actually owe. People will actually pay. And they'll actually see that message versus email. You send an email invoice or invoice in the mail, it might just get trashed.
Voicemail, right?
Yeah, and voicemails. I don't even listen to voicemails. Nope. That's for my mom.
Nope. Yeah, not at all. Why don't you share one with us, and then we'll move on.
Sure. So one of the pivots that we definitely took as we saw COVID unfolding was in our website and e-commerce space. So as local businesses went and had to redefine how they kept in contact with their customers. We had to support them. One of the big ones that we definitely did was listening to our customers and hearing that, gone were the days that they would create a website and put up their hours of operation and then never touch it again. Now we needed them to be able to update it real time, daily, and things that were outside of their control. So, whether they were open or closed, whether they were helping customers off hours or not, whether they were, if you went to their location, they had to wear masks or not. All of those things became real time, really fast. And one of the things that we pivoted in product on is how do we enable our customers to be able to log in really fast and be able to change those things on their websites. In the past, they might have called us to help them, but some customers needed to be able to do it real time as things were changing in their local areas, because we all live in different places and know that changed a lot during COVID. So that was a pivot that we made very fast. But just on that, COVID was a reason for a pivot in product, but we are constantly pivoting, and I know that we'll talk a little bit about that too.
Right, yeah, that's fair. And we will get into sort of that broader. Quick follow-up to that occurs to me is that, did you see a massive upskilling of small business during this process, like a digital upskilling? And are you seeing evidence of it in how your platforms are being used?
So we've seen it in a few different ways. One is that we do see people logging in to their builders, to their websites a lot more, and they're asking us more questions. So we are pushing more information out to them to help them with updating their website or doing the tasks that they now need to do more readily available to them. The other thing that we're seeing is that they need more help. So, they're trying to figure out how to keep their doors open. They're calling us and helping, and that's where our professional services have really grown, and helping our customers in that way.
Yeah, I think on the local business side, with the local businesses that Podium interacts with, one thing that we saw was that, basically local business has been neglected from a technology perspective for years, right? A lot of more innovative, fast-growing tech companies have gone after e-commerce, right? Like, e-commerce is the future, it's growing, and that's why you have the Shopifys of the world, et cetera, right? And that meant that local business was ignored. Then COVID hits, and people just can't rely on these crutches that they've always relied on, right? Like, my technology sucks, it's mostly a phone and some sticky notes, and I've got a calendar on the wall for auto parts that I write things on, right? And all of a sudden, they realize, I need technology too. And so they're scrambling to learn things, they're scrambling to buy things. It's been a great opportunity for technology companies that were already positioning themselves to serve this underserved segment. And so I felt, really quite fortunate to be in a situation where, like, oh, here's a customer that really wants to learn, and I actually have something to teach them and offer them. So it's pretty interesting.
So, it's a debatable point to the degree to which we're emerging from this thing. I mean, we're still wearing masks. I mean, it's right. One of these situations where we're
someday.
Yeah, I would say we're partway, but not all the way there. But put it however you like. But is there sort of what are you seeing happening as, of course, as restaurants are more open, businesses more open? Sort of the pivot after the pivot. How has your product had to change again to sort of adapt to this more hybrid reality?
Yeah, it's not a reversion, right? So what we're seeing is not, COVID's over, back to normal.
All that stuff.
There's no back to normal, especially because many of the things that were introduced during COVID turned out to just be good shit, right? So a good example of that is Zoom, right? Like, will any of our companies ever be the same again post-COVID when it comes to how we meet with each other? I suspect not. I'm at this conference today, not because of COVID necessarily, but I'm at this conference today, and we have exec meetings going on back at Podium, and, well, I called in and Zoomed in. Would I have been able to do that prior to COVID? Yeah, I mean, there was video conferencing stuff out there, but were all of our rooms at HQ outfitted to support that really well? No, they're not. Now, I log in the meeting, and they can see my face on a 6-foot screen, and it's really embarrassing because they can see all my pores. So likewise with our customers, we're seeing the same thing, right? Where they have adopted certain practices, specifically messaging at every point in the customer journey. Oh, I'm going to text them this, I'm going to update them about their appointment, I'm going to collect payment, etc. They've adopted all these technologies, and now that COVID is easing up and more people are coming back into physical locations, it doesn't mean that they're giving that stuff up. It's now a both and rather than a revert back to the mean.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And just to add a little bit to it, we're also seeing that there's the late adopters that are finally coming over. So even though in 2020 we put out all these great things and we listened to the customers and we asked them, what did they need? But really, I heard somebody else talk about it's really finding the job to be done. That's really critical. There's still a lot of local businesses that haven't adopted. So we're starting to see the trends of, some of these long tail customers that had to take longer to get there are now coming online. And that's why we continue to see the growth in some of the areas that definitely popped during COVID, but it continues on. And I completely agree, it's not changing. And now we have to almost service both worlds much better.
Right.
So I want to kind of move into a broader discussion of the product process. We had a great prep call where we kind of we talked about this, the COVID stuff, but then we had a really interesting conversation about the discipline of product. And what I learned a lot from that conversation. And part of it was this, just how it's gone from being sort of an undefined to a very defined role. And John, maybe you could start telling it, tell us what that means, and then let's get into what it means, what the implications of that are for how products are built, how quickly they're built, how well they're built, and so on.
So the question was just talking about the evolution of product?
Of the role of the product.
Of the role,
yeah.
of the role. Yeah. So I've been building products now for over a decade, and it's really interesting how, especially in software, right? The way that people think product happens is that it's like, oh, I get some software engineers and I lock them in a garage and I provide them with pizza and Red Bull or the energy drink of their choice, and out pops a product, right? But if you roll back the clock on a number of product companies, both software and otherwise, you'll find that the role of product manager was played by somebody. Right? Often a founder or some other executive, maybe a marketer steps in because they're close to the customer, salesperson steps in, they're close to the customer, right? And they fill in the gaps. But someone has always been road mapping, right? And saying like, hey, this is our mission, here's what we want to measure to see if we succeed, and I have a hypothesis that we could build this, this, and this, and that might actually help move our goals forward. And let's measure and find out, and then refine. And so over the years, that's kind of happened organically, right? But then companies have realized, oh man, I've got these huge dreams. I want to build these big products, right? I want to build a platform. It's going to do this. And there have not been people around to keep tabs on all that stuff, right? And so we start experimenting with some role called product manager that helps coordinate between, engineers and designers and the marketing team and the sales team and all these folks. It starts laying out all right, here's what we're going to measure. Here's what we're going to go do. And so over time, the job has turned into a real job, right? We still don't really see college degrees in this thing yet, so it's not quite to that level.
Do you think that's inevitable, or do you think that's coming? Is there evidence of that now?
I mean, it's such a interdisciplinary thing, right? And so much of it leans on things like, can you communicate well, right? That I have no doubt certification programs will continue to appear. I think there already are a few certifications. I could see a master's degree at some point that'll be interdisciplinary, kind of like an MBA. But, nothing like, I got my undergrad degrees in pure mathematics. I don't foresee product manager really having a bachelor's of product management. Maybe. Stranger things have happened, right? But I don't know that that's quite necessary. I really don't. But nevertheless, we now have training programs. We now have books. We now have speakers. We now have doofuses like myself showing up at conferences being like, product management. So it's a real thing now with skills you could actually write down, and you could actually evaluate people's performances and promote them, right? So it has evolved substantially over the last decade.
What's interesting is how has that changed how products are being built, and is there other pros and cons to that? Maybe, Kim, you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I was just, as you were talking, I was laughing because I remember sitting there one day and thinking, wow, this new person just joined the company and he has a fancy name for product management. And I'm like, what's that? And he tells me a little bit. I'm like, oh, I've been doing that for years. Okay, I guess I'll take that title too. Right? So it's just kind of this evolution, and it's kind of grown. One of the things that we talked about, though, was around the vocabulary that is now available to us. Product management wasn't a thing. I started off as product marketing, I believe, and wore all the hats. And I was also what I would consider like a jack of all trades. I did all the piece parts. And now as we continually get faster, the speed to market, the technology that's coming out, we're now having to grow with that as well. And now you're seeing other jobs come out of it, product owners and different pieces that we're now separating. And when I sit there and I say, okay, well, I guess we could have a person that is a SME in product this and a SME in product that. This all makes sense because we have to be able to move so fast these days that the generalist that I grew up being is kind of outdated. I cannot physically move as fast as the industry is moving. I mean, I like to think I can, but for us to continue up with the speed, and we talked a lot about how, as things become more available to us and we can pivot faster in product and our roadmaps are changing and things outside of our control like COVID coming in and we have to pivot, you need those specific jobs to be able to pivot faster and be able to keep up with what the industry is doing.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing a lot of specialization, right? Product managers who specialize in building API products for developers, right? Or product managers who are former designers that specialize in building out design systems. And you ask kind of like, what are the positives and negatives, right? I think it's a huge positive to have an industry where like, all right, this particular job is professionalizing, right? And that there's a bigger pool of folks that do it, and I can hire better, et cetera. I think one of the big drawbacks, though, which you see across industries, right? We could roll back the clock 50 years and look at management and see the same thing, is all of a sudden now I have folks who can speak a particular language, but they still might suck at their job, right? Like you have framework wonks who can just drop a framework for every particular situation your company or your product could ever be in. Like, well, in that I use an analysis like this. But then maybe they can't get the job done, right? Maybe they can't, it's a highly interdisciplinary job. Can you really work with all these different folks? Can you have great relationships with engineers and designers and marketing to get this thing done? Can you understand our customer really well, right? Like there's a lot of things where just knowing the vocabulary is not enough. And so any industry that matures, you're just going to end up with folks who can kind of pose. And I think we're at that point now, and that's fine. And maybe you end up hiring some of them, so you just got to learn how to fire fast. But that's kind of the place we're at.
Another thing we sort of talked about was this notion that having so much structure promotes a certain amount of rigidity in the product process. Are you experiencing that? And how do you sort of fight through that?
Yeah, I think, now that product processes have matured, and we've seen this across not just product management, but engineering itself, design itself, right? People begin to like say like, oh, well, this is how it's done, right? But we have to understand that products exist at sort of like different levels of maturity, right? And it could be that the market is at a different level of maturity. Your customers want slightly different things. And because of that, you want to behave in different ways, right? So at Podium, one of the first products we introduced was local business reviews, right? So, all right, someone comes into your business, they transact, I'm going to shoot them a text that's like, hey, leave me a review on Google, right? And that product has been out now for about, I want to say 6 years, right? It's very mature. We've built a lot on it, and our customers have a lot of demands, and it's one of the primary things that Podium does. Therefore, the way I treat it is with kid gloves, and I treat it with a lot of understanding of what the current customer wants. There's also a lot of competitors and copycats now, so I got to think through that. It's a very different product than something like, say, payments, right? Podium went into payments during COVID. We're moving very, very fast, and we're competing against the landscape that kind of, it's just like a bunch of old banks, right? Totally different context. And so I ask my teams to behave in different ways, right? On one product, hey, if you're going to really mess with this, it's kind of risky because that's where all our traffic is and that's where we make a lot of our money. On another product, oh, we don't have as many folks using it. So go ahead and break that thing, burn it to the ground. We'll stand it back up tomorrow, right? They can behave differently. And when you get really rigid with your practices because you say, well, this is how it's done, that can get you in trouble.
Well, and identifying where your products are in their life cycle is critical and something that, some businesses have adopted to really fast. You've picked up on it yourself. We also have the same, it's okay, thanks. We also have the same thing at Newfold. We have product lines that are very mature. We can't disrupt the customers that are on it right now. And then we have other ones that we're testing into, and you can be much more risky. And having product managers who are risk adverse are better off on our more mature products, right? And identifying those strengths and putting our strengths where we need them at the time is really important as well.
Now, a theme that's kind of talked about a lot in the product world is this idea of customer-centric product design, and we talked about that a little on our call. And just kind of each of you talk. Well, Kim, you can start. But talk about what exactly is that, and then and then what does it really mean in practice, and then again we can kind of get into, is it a sustainable approach? Are there drawbacks to it, et cetera?
Yeah, so customer-centric, I would say, is another one of those vocabulary words that have come out in the last couple of years.
Yeah, we'll have a list of them by the end of this conference.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that product specifically has done over the years is I feel like our job is to balance the customer needs and the business needs at all times. And there are things that affect that balance, but customer-centric is just understanding who your customers are and what they need. You can ask them what they think they need, but you also have to go into discovery and figure out what their true job is. Jobs to be done is another new word for you, to make sure that you're solving the problem. And I also feel like as we're going through the balancing act of what is important for our customers, but also what's important for our businesses, we've seen time and time again where things throw off that balance. COVID threw off that balance for many of us, and we had to rebalance ourselves back together. The other piece that I was going to mention is that we've kind of adjusted the way in product that we're focused on roadmaps and our customers' needs. Specifically, we're really focused these days on setting that 3-year goal. What is the goal that you're trying to achieve? To that one goal that you're trying to achieve in that area, to 3 to 5 strategies, and that's kind of what you live by. The roadmap, the initiatives, though, you can't go further than, say, 2 quarters. Things are changing too fast. The customer's needs are changing too fast, and that's where, I've been lucky at Newfold where we've already started that pivot about 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, but a lot of businesses haven't, right, when I talk to some of my peers. And so when COVID hit and it disrupted that balance, we were able to pivot or be more agile as we changed over to that. But a lot of businesses were forced into that faster. And you see that when we say, oh yeah, we just disrupted our roadmap and now we launched payments, right? Or I was more focused on getting customer access to their websites versus having to call us all the time, right? We have to be fast and responsive to what the market's demanding, what our customers are demanding, and then what also our business are demanding.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that the word customer-centric hides a lot of nuance. Right? So I think the world is full of dead companies that were customer-centric. And were customer-centric right until they died, right? So you think about something like BlackBerry. When BlackBerry was producing Blackberries, which, hopefully y'all are old enough to remember Blackberries.
Yeah.
All my examples are getting super old. But if you remember BlackBerry, right? Like, no one was like, these phones don't meet my needs. No, they kept iterating on shit that business people needed.
I think people who used Blackberries liked Blackberries.
Yeah, people who used Blackberries liked Blackberries, right? And I remember a UX researcher that I employed on one of my teams once upon a time. I delivered to my team the product vision for the next year. And she came up to me after the meeting and said, so we're not being customer-centric anymore? So we're not a customer-centric company anymore? This feels so top down. I was like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, I'm talking to our current customers, and what they're asking for is this thing, and it's not on our vision. And I believe that one of the main decisions that you have to make as a leader in a business is, when I want to be customer-centric, that means I have to position myself on a spectrum of how much am I going to satisfy the needs of my current customer and how much am I going to go after future customers. And they might be the same, right? It is possible that like, oh, I serve 10% of the market and the other 90% look identical to my 10%, and by serving the needs of my current customers, I capture all 90. But it could be that the folks who don't use your product or your service, there's a reason why they don't, and it has to do with something that your current customers are not asking for, right? And so to be customer-centric does mean having to say, I'm going to serve these current customers in this way. I'm going to serve our future customers that we don't yet have, and that could be, as you characterize as like serving the needs of the business, right? Thinking about expansion in another way, right? And so it gets to be a really tricky tightrope that you sort of can't be encompassed by just like customer-centric, right?
Right. A couple of follow-ups there. One is, you're describing two different ways of thinking about building product. One is responding to customers, and others thinking much bigger about what it takes to expand your total addressable market. Is the same mentality applicable, product building mentality applicable to both approaches? I mean, can the same team do both well?
I do believe, so the same team can do both well. I do find that there are folks who can do one a little bit better than the other, right? Because you're often getting data from different sources, right? If you want to build for current customers, dang, create a great relationship with your CS team. Go talk to them, find out, hey, why are people churning? Why are they complaining? What do they wish they had? They'll describe how they want, a better horse-drawn carriage rather than describing a car to you, to use the old sort of Henry Ford analogy, right? But there are people who are really good at that, talking to current customers, highly empathetic, et cetera. Then there are other folks who they're better at reading the market tea leaves, right? They're fielding surveys. They're going out and talking to people that we don't have. They're looking at the competition and the moves that they're making, right? There are people who can do both, but oftentimes folks might skew in one direction or the other, and how they do their analysis will then end up driving the product in a particular way.
I've seen it both, that people can do it both, but I've also seen it that you actually get more from them if you specialize them in those two different areas.
Okay. So if anyone has questions, walk up to the mic. I'll see you. Otherwise, I'll just keep asking a few more questions in the time we have left. Just want to get into some sort of, wrap up, looking ahead sort of questions. And you've talked about how the role evolved quite a bit to this point. What do you think changes in the next few? Oh, I'm
we
sorry.
actually do have a question down here.
Yeah.
Hello. Okay, so I did have just two questions, I promise. The first one, how do you accurately and fairly judge the performance of your product managers, especially in a decentralized environment and especially in an environment where we're pivoting so fast? How do you know when it's time to fire fast?
That's a great question. And it's multifaceted, right? There are just some basic skills that a product manager needs to have around can you define the mission of this team? Based on that, can you define measures of success that can actually be measured, that actually could say whether you've achieved your mission or not? And then off of that, can you hypothesize what, I bet if we tried these things, it might move this needle, execute some. You don't have to move that needle. I'm not going to fire you if you don't. But you got to tell me why the things you thought would move the needle did or didn't, why you thought they would move them, why they didn't, et cetera. You have to be able to tell that story, right? That's basics. On top of that, then, I like to think about whether a product manager can use all parts of the animal, right? A product manager that comes in is just we're building, engineers, that's all I need. That sucks. Because what's really slow is writing software. It's the slowest. It's a bummer. Right? So I want them to then think about how can I maybe reskin what I already have? How can I work better with sales and marketing to sell what I already have? And I'm thinking through all of those streams at the exact same time, right? I can move the needle with sales and marketing. I can move the needle by building new, right? And I want to see someone who can work that way, where they're communicating with their peers really well and they're communicating with leadership really well to help them understand, here's all the stuff we've got in the hopper. Right? And if I can't find someone who can do that, and instead they just gravitate to I'm telling my engineers what to do, then that's probably not going to work out. So that's kind of how I assess. Kim?
I don't have anything to add.
You got another one?
Awesome, yes. And then for product, when do you decide that it's time to fold in a product rather than continuing to innovate and trying to make it better?
It varies and it changes. Every situation is different. We have a saying that 90% of what we look at in product or what we just start discovery on never sees the light of day, right? So a lot of things you have to let it live its cycle and let it breathe as long as you can, but you have to know when the ripcord is, right? So, and that's balancing between the customer needs as well as the business needs. I think one of the things that we look a lot at is just always gut checking against what we're seeing, right? Because there's a lot of times, I like to think that our product managers are very passionate about their ideas and what they're bringing to market, and you have to use, numbers and what is the market telling us, and pulling all that together to his point of looking at it end to end. Can we sell it? Are people responding to it? Do we continuously evolve it as well? When we talk customer centric, one of the pain points that I'm seeing today is that we just keep saying customer centric. We're doing it because it's customer centric. We're doing it because it's customer centric. But I got to tell you, once that product does its job and it solves the problem for the customer, it's time to look at, do you solve it a different way? Or do you move on to the next problem? Because just continuously investing more and more into those products, you're not getting any business outcome from them.
Right.
So,
Awesome.
do you have anything to add on?
No, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Actually, that's perfect timing. We're actually out of time, and we're going to move on to lunch, which we hope you enjoy. And please join me in thanking our panel.
Thanks, John.